Dem Bones, copyright Serenya Murthy. I went out into the backyard, and as I was placing the trash in the can, I looked up in the sky and saw a star. It kind of stopped me in my tracks for a minute. I suppose I stared up at it for a while. It crossed my mind how many humans had stared up at these same stars. It felt like a rare, pure gift, as did the air, the dark silhouette of the trees against the sky. Aren't you planning on coming back inside? It was Dad. But his tone wasn't as aggressive or adversarial as usual, and I suppose this was what prompted the relative candor of my reply. I was thinking of Grandpa, I said. His eyes widened. And that time he took us camping, Lionel and me. It had been fun. We had roasted marshmallows, pitched a tent, told ghost stories, hiked, fished. Well, I drew the line at hunting because when they took me skeet shooting, I couldn't even bring myself to take down a clay pigeon, no matter how good Grandpa said I was at it. They used to rag me about it so hard. But I didn't care. It was just part of the way we were together. I mean, it wasn't like they could get rid of me. What were they going to do? Kick me out of the family and replace me with Dick Cheney? Grandpa had said the third commandment didn't extend to animal life, and Lionel said it was probably okay as long as you only killed what you ate. But I've never really been sure. There was this one time on the horse farm in Virginia. I'd been out for a midnight ride and I stopped by the Prendergast farm. Their lights were on, which surprised me. It was pretty late, and like most farmers, they're early risers. I dismounted, tied Winnie up, and headed over to the house. Maybe someone was ill and we needed to call Dr. Marshall. As I neared the stables, I heard a sound of whinnying and neighing, with heightened intensity. This made me realize that a horse was in trouble. A sense of anguish stole over me. When I entered the stables, Mrs. P had her face buried in her apron and was crying. This made me feel simply awful. Mr. Prendergast had his back to me and was working with the injured animal. I couldn't bear to look, but even without looking, I could tell that the horse was in immense pain, and it twisted my insides like something physical. Mrs. Prendergast's pain I could handle, so I placed my arm around her. She looked up at me in momentary surprise and instantly hugged me. Oh, Jason. I hugged her back. Go home, son. Mr. Prendergast's tone was brusque, but I knew better than to take it to heart. This is no place for you. There's no need to be so curt with him, Mrs. P remonstrated. He's just a boy. Mr. Prendergast snorted and rubbed his hands. Darn rheumatoid arthritis, he grumbled. Is there anything I can do? I asked, more out of habit than anything else. Not a damn thing, Mr. Prendergast snapped. Eli, Mrs. P coaxed. There isn't anything an 11-year-old punk kid can do, Nellie. Mr. Prendergast cast a disparaging look over his shoulder at me. Least of all him. The scorn in his voice was indescribable, but it wasn't worse than anything I hadn't already heard from Dad. Besides, I didn't really care. It wasn't about him. Mrs. Prendergast was sad. An animal was in pain. The whole thing reeked of inhumanity. I wanted to help. I knew what Mom would have done. Would you like me to go get my mom? I offered. No. Mr. Prendergast rose heavily to his feet. It'll be too late by then. He looked at Mrs. Prendergast. We can't prolong his suffering any longer. He shook his head. She began to weep softly. I hugged her. In retrospect, you'd think they'd be used to it, old farmhands that they were, but the truth was, the sight of any one of God's creatures suffering wrung Mrs. P's heart, and that wrung Mr. P's heart. He strove not to express it, but I could always tell. You were once such a straight shot, I heard Mrs. P reflect wistfully. Mr. Prendergast looked down at his hands, old, gaunt, wrinkled, and shook his head. I noticed that his hands were also shaking, against his will. This frightened me. He was always such a controlled man, gruff, crotchety, but always in control. Are you all right, Mr. Prendergast? The words escaped my lips before I could stop them. I prepared for him to reprove me for my presumption. I was, after all, an 11-year-old punk kid, as he expressed it, while he remained the oldest, most experienced, and most respected farmer in Westcott history. Instead, He looked at me with the strangest expression in his eyes. Jason, his tone was the gentlest I've ever heard it. Would you do something for me? To this day, I've never been quite certain whether I did the right thing.